Welcome to today's SCA webinar with Dr. Amalia Oliveira Riley on optimization as a path to lower emissions, myth or reality. Amalia leads SCA's business advisory services, which include those related to asset value optimization, organizational efficiency, non-operator influence, strategy, and transformation. Before we start today's webinar, we'd like to ask a few questions about the demographics of the audience. So I'm going to launch the polling questions. And you should see the first question: what is your primary discipline? We're starting to get some responses. Looks like we have quite a few geoscientists in the audience and some engineers as well. The votes are still coming in, but right now it's 50-50 between geoscientists and facility engineers. We have a few in the other category. We're still collecting votes. And people are still logging in, so we have people that are just now seeing that we're conducting a poll on what's your primary discipline. We have some petroleum engineers in the audience. Looks like most of you have voted now, so I'm going ahead and close the poll and share. And this audience today, we have 43% geoscientists, 29% facility engineers, and evenly split between the petroleum engineers and the other category at 14%. So let me go to the next polling question. How many years of full-time experience do you have in the upstream oil and gas industry? This must be an easier question because people are voting faster this time. So we're getting, the majority of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Looks like 44% are right in the middle at 11 to 20 years. And then we have 33% at 21 to 30 years and 22% over 30 years experience in the upstream oil and gas industry. So before I introduce Dr. Oliveira Riley, I'd like to remind the audience that you are muted, but you can ask questions during the presentation using the GoToWebinar question feature, and we'll cover the Q&A at the end of the presentation. You will be anonymous. So welcome to today's webinar on optimization as a path to lower emissions, myth or reality. We're getting ready to start now. And our speaker today is Dr. Amalia Oliveira Riley. She is an executive leader with more than 30 years of experience in the oil and gas industry. She's held executive positions at ExxonMobil, Repsol, and Tullow Oil. And she's particularly interested in some of her strengths that include strategic vision, technical and organizational leadership, and implementing change. And she's worked in 5 continents and more than 40 countries in various depositional environments. Amalia was on the World Energy Council 2020 list of influential women in industries, and she's won in the energy industry, and she's won a number of other accolades in the oil and gas industry. She has a PhD in geoscience from Purdue, and she's lived and worked in Houston, in London, and Madrid, and grew up in Argentina. So Amalia leads SCA's business advisory services. This is a new service that is she will be championing, and she's bringing all of her experience to bear as she's taking some of these techniques and sharing them with others as leading transformational change. So you can look at SP's website for more details on the business advisory services. So SCA will be at the CCUS conference at the University of Houston. This is the joint conference offered by SPE, APG, and SEG. And there are some free webinars coming up. We have Geosteering Best Practices with Jamie Woolsey and Sarah Kalner. And then Why a No Geology Model Helps Us Understand Geology with Larry Lake and Jerry Jensen. We have some live online classes that are available virtually. Dr. John Lee will be teaching PRMS, SEC reserves, and resource regulations. And we have Leo Roldhart and Garrett Knitters, who will be teaching a well stimulation workshop. Both of these are offered virtually live online. Other live online classes go into the CCUS space. We have Dr. Steve Sonnenberg speaking on CCUS, a geological perspective, in April. And then in May, we have Dr. Christine Eleg-Economides and Dr. Dimitris Hazignatou, who will be teaching together a CCUS class from an engineering perspective. And of course, if there are in-person classes that you'd like to bring to your location, you can contact us and we can arrange for in-house classes. And in addition to training, look to SCA for all of your consulting needs, for direct hire staffing, both contract and full-time positions, and for projects and studies. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the presentation rights over to Amalia. So let me do that real quickly. And you should have the presentation rights.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan, for your kind introduction. Let's see if I can put this on slide mode. Are you seeing my screen? Susan,
Looks
are you
good.
seeing my screen?
Yes, yeah. Looks great.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll have a nice conversation on optimization as a path to lower emissions, myth or reality. What I'd like to discuss today, a little bit of the conventional view on this dichotomy of lower emissions or optimization. Typically, we see this as things that are incompatible. We'll take a look at linking optimization and emissions, and we'll do that through walking across some of the aspects of asset optimization that could potentially help us with the task of lowering emissions. And then we'll also look at other low-hanging fruit topics, some that we typically don't think of as paths to lower emissions. And we'll talk about a few conclusions. So let's get started with the conventional view. Typically, when a company in the upstream thinks of lowering emissions, the drivers are investor pressure, compliance, and also, of course, knowing that it's the right thing to do to contribute to a cleaner world. And typically, these programs are seen as things above the business and things that go beyond our, regular call of duty. So when we look at these programs, the first thing that comes to mind is increased cost. It's this new program that we have to support. We really need to get new expertise. We need to hire new people and learn how to do things that we haven't done in the past. And we focus a lot on offset programs and projects, and all of this is kind of outside our day-to-day business. So it implies an important learning curve. So while we look at this as something that has to be done, we want to do, it's a bit of a burden on the value that drives our business. On the contrary, our optimization efforts are typically driven by the opposite kinds of values. We think of creating additional value. We focus on company performance. We look at financial constraints, and those are, especially in the last couple of years, they have been strong drivers for optimization efforts. And the expectation in these kinds of programs are around reduced costs. So nothing like, new programs. It's reduced program, reduce people, reduce things to do. Focus on fewer programs, and typically results in limited resources for learning. So it's understandable that these two are seemingly quite opposed. In a nutshell, then we look at lower emissions and value as things that are completely opposite to each other. And we get this feeling of love-hate relationship between the two programs or the two kinds of efforts. So how can we link optimization and lower emissions? Well, we'll just walk through a few ways of looking at optimization areas, what outcomes may result, and then what could be the lower emissions impact. And we'll do this in a fairly simplified, high-level way for the moment, just to get us on topic. So we'll look at the optimization area, the outcome, and the impact. Let's start with those asset value efforts. If with the outcome of an asset value effort is an optimized operation, then we might be able to identify reduced waste and circular economy opportunities. So, those are ways and we can contribute to lower emissions. If we focus on operational excellence, which is another area that, all of you have done in the past a lot, I'm sure, we may look at reduced drilling time or reduced downtime, and those, of course, result in lower energy consumption. So there's another way of getting on board with the lower emissions. And finally, in terms of the safety performance, if we reduce incident-related downtime and avoid the restart of operations, that's another area where we can quickly link optimization to lower emissions. So what we'll do next is let's take a look at asset value optimization as a whole and walk through a few of the aspects of value optimization, and we'll see how each one of them can potentially contribute a little bit to the efforts for lowering emissions. All right, when we think of asset value optimization, here's a few aspects that we typically look into. We look at operations themselves, we look at safety, we also look at supply chain and the commercialization, our monetization efforts. And all of this is tied together with management efforts. And last but not least, the subsurface understanding underpins any efforts that we could run on an asset. As being a geoscientist myself, and I know there's many of you in the audience, the subsurface is what rules anything else that we do with an asset. What we'll do is walk through each one of these aspects and take a look at a few things that we could consider in an effort to find ways to lower emissions. Let's take a look at operations first. So this is a pretty obvious place to start, right? Our operations consume energy themselves, and quite obvious that if we look at optimizing, we will look at every way of the chain of operations that take place. A few of the approaches that I would suggest here is looking at 80% tasks. And with that, I mean, rather than making an exhaustive list of every task that we perform during an operation, let's focus on those that have the greatest potential impact on energy consumption, on reducing leakages, on making things more efficient. So focusing on a few things that have high impact, in my view, is a better bang for the buck type of approach. A couple of other things in this area that sometimes get overlooked are the areas of roles and responsibilities, accountability, and communication. And while this seemingly seems off topic, it has a huge impact on how we run the operations, how quickly we make decisions, and how quickly we implement the decisions that we make. And in each one of those, there is areas for gaining some efficiencies. So I would suggest that those are areas that also belong to the operation bucket. And of course, considering the energy consumption and evaluation plans for optimization. So we might decide to optimize an asset. We want to make additional fracs. or change the way we supply water or gas injection. But it's important that we take into account the energy consumed the energy consumed in these new efforts. If we look at safety, that's another area that typically doesn't get proposed or put forward with this view. And really, it makes a lot of sense to think if you have a safe operation, then you avoid downtimes. You don't have unplanned stops and starts. You're not spending time dealing with the outcomes of incidents. Definitely makes your operation more efficient. So, of course, the initial point is to create a culture of caring and propose this as something that must happen and that is embraced by the top leadership. Tracking and rewarding people for their safe performance is an important aspect of this, but also including the safe operations as a key contributor to value. And also looking at highlighting spill prevention as a key environmental activity. So a whole lot of gains can be made in the safety realm that beyond, keeping everyone safe and cared for can have a significant input or improvement into value optimization. Another area that is being looked at more recently with a lot more detail is supply chain. In many of our mature assets, we will have had long-term contracts, and frequently those are set up early on in the life of the field, and they remain as the same contracts forever. And with the volatility and the progress in additional production of supplies in various areas, we may be missing opportunities for alternatives from the local suppliers, creating new synergies with other local industries that are emerging, and for recycling or reusing. So this is an area that can have great impact on emissions. More lately, people are also looking at circular economies as a possibility. So supply chain has a lot to offer, and typically would have been it wouldn't have been the focus of our optimization efforts, yet it's one that can contribute a lot to value optimization as well as lowering emissions. Here, it's important to understand where your products come from, what's the transport time and consumption of energy and that transport to bring your supplies to your location, as well as the storage and the and also the new possibilities of the local products. Let's take a look at monetization or commercialization. Again, if we look at optimizing assets that are quite mature, it is important to every so often review the commercial options. Many of the local markets have changed, and in a lot of areas, gas is now being used in areas where they didn't have commercialization possibilities in the past. A lot has improved in terms of gas reinjection. So the commercialization piece is one that deserves quite a bit of scrutiny and can contribute significantly to the emissions program, particularly if we're able to handle the gas in different ways and avoid flaring. And finally, along this set of factors in terms of management, we'll look back at clear span of authority as a key factor that can optimize things. Why is this? Well, when you have clear authority, people are, they know what decisions they can make and they can implement them as soon as they make them. And so this saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of complexities in terms of being able to run the asset in a more efficient way. And it has the the additional benefit of appealing to the individual sense of responsibility as world citizens, so people can feel like they're part of something big that they're contributing to. And again, last but not least, understanding the subsurface, especially mature assets where the initial design of facilities was planned with the early understanding of the asset, and now 10, 15 years later, with a lot of new wells drilled and production performance and so on, the view of the field may have changed significantly. This could be an area that could highlight what asset optimization efforts can be applied. In many assets, we have newly volumes of gas developed by or revealed by the more recent drilling. We find ways of reinjecting into reservoirs that were looked at in the initial development plans. So there's a lot that happens with an updated subsurface view that can contribute to improving your overall asset performance. So this is kind of the general ways of approaching it. What I thought I'd do is I'll share a few examples from my experience in which some of these different aspects were applied to an asset optimization effort. Some, I'll have a full case study with many of these were applied, and then I'll have a few examples of where maybe safety made a difference or subsurface made a difference and so on, just to illustrate how this can be applied. And that will wrap it up. 2 disclaimers here. I'll talk about some of the assets that I've managed personally, but also about some of the assets that I was part of a executive leadership team in running in the various companies I participated in. So we'll keep it quite generic to not disclose the details of any one of the assets or companies, but at the same time, they illustrate the point. And the second disclaimer is on the figures or photos that I've chosen. They're generic and they're not related directly to the assets I work with. So the first one, for the full case study, we'll talk about Africa offshore assets. So we're looking at a deep water asset. It was an asset that had significant downtime, and this impacted production, accelerated decline, and it had just a lot of different issues with it. The first approach, and as I mentioned, what underpins everything is the understanding of the subsurface. So after over 10 years of production, there was a whole restudy, redefinition of the subsurface of the asset. And this was actually really important, not only for looking at new development locations for drilling, but also for decisions on the FPSOs that were now outdated and needed either repairs or upgrades or redesigns. So here's a really good example where, you know, the basics really make a difference on what you do with your facilities. The result for this particular effort was an updated development and facility utilization plan, and this included now looking at ways to monetize the gas instead of flaring, and that had an impact on the pressure in the reservoirs and the amount of production that could be projected for the upcoming years. So the subsurface has huge impact here. The second aspect in the same asset was a renewed view on their management structure. And although they had a team managing the asset in the past, they kind of went through a designated leader with broader accountability. And this leader was provided visibility at the highest executive level. So there was this regular exposure and regular support from top leadership with this new manager for the asset. This was particularly important because it created a culture of safe speak. Whereas in the past, there would have been a lot of I'll wait for someone else to pass on the bad news, or, I'll tell someone and they'll tell someone and they'll tell someone, and eventually someone will find out, or we'll wait for the next opportunity to meet with the leadership to communicate this. This communication of difficult news got accelerated in such a way that it helped avoid downtime. And by bringing the issues early, they were dealt with before they became too difficult. So here's an example on how changing your management style can have huge impact on the performance of your assets. And going on with the same example, the operations efforts were focused on the maintenance schedule, and in a way that they were looking to avoid or plan downtime a little better. And the key thing was to track this downtime ferociously and make it the utmost preoccupation of the whole team. And these efforts resulted in 97% uptime. So huge kudos to the team that could do that, just tracking maintenance. Of course, safety was brought to the forefront for this asset to work out better. And it became part of the embedded objectives for the culture. And so this contributed to the reduced downtime from incidents. So this tied to the operations effort, those two, really looking at safety as a contributor to value was significant in supporting this improvement. The safety effort also identified fugitive emissions in storage tanks and addressed those to, this were kind of two ways. It removed the safety hazard and it improved the emission profile. So again, safety was an area that could contribute significantly to the emissions optimization. Excuse me. And then we'll also look at supply chain in the same asset. The team looked relentlessly for opportunities to optimize contracts. Part of the effort was focused on just-in-time delivery, and part of it was to minimize the storage needs and the clutter of the FPSO. So a couple of different things happened. The economics of when the purchases were made and delivered was optimized, and also the safety was improved in the FPSO with this decluttering. So you probably don't think of supply chain and safety having much to do, but there's ways to link them and make them work for the best. The second effort here was to work with local suppliers and identify areas where they could bring products without the long transport cost and emissions. And that also got us some goodwill from the local government. So again, sometimes we don't think of how these things relate to each other, but there's many ways to link them together. The final aspect of work in this asset offshore Africa was monetization. And one of the key things was to identify potential alternatives for future gas production that to date were limited. And the initial contracts didn't consider the commercialization with the gas, because in the 10 years ago or 15 years ago, the economics with just the production of the oil and flaring were good enough to support the development of the asset. Well, in today's world, to think of flaring as the main thing you do with the gas, it's just not acceptable. And also the local market has developed over the 10 years with additional needs for that gas. And so working with the government, not only in the present, but laying out plans where that gas could supply the local market and become part of the economics of the asset. It's just a win-win from so many different angles. So hopefully this illustrates in an asset, as you look through all these different areas, how you can optimize the value and the performance of the asset and also create a positive impact in terms of emissions. We'll move to other examples that are more kind of one-off in the various assets that I've worked in my career. So one example that I really like I guess in the Caribbean offshore, we looked at management coordinating all of the aspects of this remote exploration operation in an area that had really high stakes from tourism. And what was really neat about that is instead of working each one of the aspects of the operation isolated, by bringing it all together, we came up with a really ingenious way to make this operation happen where we didn't have any shore bases nearby, and was quite difficult for any kind of impact on the nearby areas supported due to the tourism. So what the key aspect that led to success here was contracts and logistics, co-designing a unique operation with the Gulf of Mexico base, supplying all of the vessels with all the materials in 2 trips. So this avoided, supply boats coming to the operation, and it avoided also having any kind of onshore footprint in this nice area. So I think this was a really ingenious way to run this operation, and it couldn't have been possible unless all of the teams were communicating together in terms of, drilling, understanding how many of the supplies we could have on the platform at once, how many could be in the supply boats, how long they could be there. Just a lot of different things that were coordinated. Let's move to another example now in Africa onshore. In terms of safety, which turned out to be the key aspect for our improved operation, we work with a contractor to update plans on the fly. And this on the fly was because the area was remote, and there were some newly identified hazards that popped up. And we were doing this onshore operation during the pandemic, and that also meant a lot of contact with local populations. And so we had to, come up on the fly with different ways to handle things. But we were able to come up with a reduced plan and reduce the number of camps that were needed to run this operation, reducing the footprint, and then reducing environmental impact. So this is another area where, coming from the safety angle, we were able to reduce our emissions. Let's move to onshore and conventional in South America. One of the assets that I work with identified local water and sand supplies to minimize trucking time and therefore emissions for transport to the location. So again, an example where your supply chain has impact on how you run your operations. And this also contributes to lower cost if you don't have long trucking areas to go through. So working with local suppliers can be a key to improving things for your operation and your emissions. And another approach that I saw applied to this unconventional assets was to build smaller power plants utilizing the gas. So in the early stages of exploitation of this asset, the gas wasn't going to be monetized, but it could be used locally to supply power. So a bit of generating a circular economy here through these power plants. And now for a completely different part of the world, onshore conventional in South America, but now we're in Colombia. This is an area where a full field model update after 15 years of production supported optimization of injector and producer well pairs and reduce the total water use for our operation. So again, different ways of doing what we do, we know how to do, and applying our good old techniques with a renewed focus on emissions and on optimization can help us make headway in terms of performance. So hopefully all these examples illustrated a little bit of the experience around the world, the various assets, and how the aspects that I proposed, and these are just a few, but how these can contribute to lowering emissions and be linked to optimized operations. Now, let's take a look at other, I call it other low-hanging fruit, and how strategy, for example, can be a good driver for optimized and lower emissions operations. In the strategy piece, everything from choosing your partners to setting the criteria for a geographic focus or a type of efforts that you want in your portfolio can be ways to drive your carbon footprint. Part of it is that requires planning for the long term, but we see many companies now taking this into their core of their strategy as what kinds of assets they'll get into. And then the other one we'll talk about is organizational efficiency, with lean organizations supporting this agile decision making. And this can be really the backbone, the basis of efficient operations. There are many ways in which today's connectivity and the pandemic has also taught us how to work remotely and virtually and connecting in different ways, and this enables new possibilities for an efficient work environment and minimize the impact on, due to employee travel and things like that. We'll take a look at a couple of examples where strategy or organizational efficiency have made a difference in optimizing asset performance. The first example will be in onshore and conventional in South America. And this is one example where the targeted partners from the early stages of what acreage we go into were those that would support the full application of our cutting edge and energy efficient technologies. So rather than looking at the whole gamut of potential partners as valid, we early on decided what kinds of partners we wanted to join. And this was one of the criteria that was set up in terms of go, no go. Sometimes you choose operators that have their own techniques that you agree with, and sometimes you would choose operators that are willing to hand over the operation to you if you have an advantage in the way you do things. The final example is an organizational efficiency, and this is one where the organization was transformed into a centralized technology application, and this team of high experts had then the mandate to bring the latest technologies and the best techniques to all of the assets around the world. So two things happened here. For one, there was a lot more learning from assets in the various affiliates into the central group. And with that learning, there was also transfer of technologies from one remote asset, let's say in Asia, to another remote asset in Alaska. And also there was an increased learning and cohesivity in how we deployed technology and drove the asset's performance from this central group. And many of these specialists wouldn't have been called upon unless there was a detected issue in the assets in the previous model, and with the centralized model, the specialists were brought in to evaluate any areas that they could potentially contribute to. So this is one way in which organizational efficiency or centralized technology application, in this case, could make an impact. And there was a lot of elimination of duplicate tasks through this model. So in conclusions, I hope that through this discussion, I was able to bring you a way of looking at optimizations and emissions, pulling into the right in the similar way, so that we can increase value together rather than to pull away from each other in opposite directions. linking lower emission efforts to business optimization could be a really good way, an effective way to deliver value. And more than anything, it keeps the business focused. We're not trying to do new things, different things, things we don't know about. And it strengthens the core business. And it doesn't require the high effort. These are the things that we know how to do. So I think it's a really nice way to empower what we do and align it to our current efforts to drive down emissions. And while asset optimization, operational excellence, and efficiency are obvious areas for emission footprints, there's other areas like strategy, organization, or digital efforts that can make significant contributions. So with that, I guess we'll open that to questions, please.
Great, thank you. I'd like to remind the audience you are muted, but you can ask questions using the GoToWebinar question feature, and you will be anonymous. Later today, you'll receive a link to a recording of today's webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to SCA's website with more information about the business advisory services provided by Dr. Olivera Riley, including asset value optimization, organizational efficiency, non-operator influence and strategy and transformation. So first question, Amalia, you've mentioned several times the circular economy. Could you please describe what you mean by that phrase, circular economy?
Yeah, so that phrase encompasses utilizing things that would have been waste before, finding ways to use or reuse or recycle things that would have been wasted in previous efforts. And part of that refers to either supplies on the platforms that we can find different ways to use them, or that we can find local businesses that can now use them for some of their purposes. And some of that is now possible because in areas, for example, in remote offshore Africa, those economies have been growing so fast over the last 10 years, and things have changed so much that things that 10 years ago when we started developing those fields wouldn't have had any kind of local businesses that could use anything. Now those areas have developed significantly to provide some options for these kinds of circular economy opportunities.
Thank you. The next question, it looks like in implementing some of your strategies, there's a lot of metrics, there's a lot of collecting of data involved. How do you simplify that process to show that you're actually lowering the emissions in some of these strategies?
Yeah, that's a good point. So many of the, there's data that has been collected regularly that in the past has not been used or taken advantage of. And much of that now with the digital technologies, we're able to leverage and analyze on the fly. So that provides an opportunity for developing metrics and understanding the impact of these various, aspects that we could be improving or changing.
So in several cases, you talked about supply chain and changing the distance that supplies are being sourced using a more local economy. How do you measure the impact of that, and what are the options around the world for that?
Yeah, so in that case, it's measuring the transport options for your supplies and understanding whether they come by boat or plane or trucking, and what areas they traverse and what are the emissions of those transport options to your location. We tend to, a lot of times we do big blanket supply contracts with suppliers that maybe are in the US or in Europe, and we use those for all of our operations all over the world. And there's more and more options to perhaps identify local suppliers, let's say for an asset in Asia that don't have to come all the way from the United States or from Europe. It can, potentially come from other local areas. Particularly in the two examples that I provided were in onshore operations where the trucking has a significant impact not only for the emissions of the trucks, but also for the impact on the maintenance of the roads where those trucks are going through and having to have those roads, rebuilt often. So understanding where your local supplies are for sand or water can be areas that can have an important impact.
And how do you address concerns about the quality of the supplies or the sand or the water, whatever it is that you're sourcing compared to the more traditional sources?
Yeah, the trick is in the devil's in the details, as they say, right? To understand whether those supplies will be of the right quality. There's also the opportunity to bring that topic to the local suppliers and pose to them the challenge that, look, this could be a really good solution if quality could be up to snuff. So there's those kinds of conversations that can contribute to make things happen. It might take a little while, but I think it's a worthy cause.
Tell us more about how revisiting long-term contracts can add value versus negotiating new contracts. It would seem like that would take a lot of time to negotiate a new contract.
Yeah, so there's, for one, the time it takes to deliver those contracts, but also the fact that we used to live in a more steady environment, and long-term contracts could be foreseen as a better option. With the volatile conditions, you can quickly get the supplier or the buyer upside down, and there is more willingness, I perceive, in terms of revisiting terms that were signed, many years ago. And there's also willingness to put in clause for triggers to renegotiate. So you could stay with your supplier, yet review terms every so often as a way to ensure that the volatility doesn't damage one of the parties or, into bad shape.
Certainly during times of contract extensions, that would be a natural time to look to negotiate new terms in some of these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
and many of these fields had different views on their lifetime early on than they do, 10 or 15 years down the road. You have a different view of what the field can provide, and the length of the contracts can be revised on the basis of that new subsurface model that you're now building with increased data and, better reduced uncertainty in some ways. Yeah.
So are there any emerging trends in international contracts with regards to carbon neutral goals? Are you seeing any of that out in the marketplace?
I have not seen that precisely in that explicit of a way. At the same time, everyone is kind of worrying about it in terms of being able to demonstrate how they contribute to being a better world citizen. So no, I have not seen that explicitly. I don't know if anyone in the audience may have. It'd be interesting to know.
You mentioned recharacterization. So doing new reservoir and geoscience subsurface studies can lead to new field development plans, new facility utilization plans. Talk more about the opportunities to maximize and extend the life of a facility in these areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one because it goes right with the core of what we know how to do. We know how to do subsurface studies, and we know how to plan facilities. And there's been a whole lot of developments over the last 10 years in terms of facilities with being able to refurbish and reutilize all facilities and bring to another way. There's mobile production units that are now available. So there's a whole lot of other options that we didn't have, 10 or 15 years ago. They're more modular, they're more mobile, they're more adaptable. And so maybe in essence where, the reinjection of gas was established early on to be a certain proportion, and as the life of the asset progresses, you foresee that there's much more gas to handle. You're able to bring a mobile unit to handle the additional gas and re-inject that you couldn't have done, 20 years ago when you first designed the platform. First, it wasn't in your radar screen as an opportunity or an issue to deal with. And secondly, we didn't have those mobile production units available to us. So there's quite a bit of possibilities I see in that realm for one to understand the subsurface better, it's kind of like redefine the approach to the development in terms of the usage of the fluids, which was, we had a different view of the world then. And then take advantage of these new technologies for easy, more mobile, more adaptable platforms and production units to help implement those new designs.
Talk more about those new technologies that are available that can help us to reduce emissions.
Okay. So the first new technologies are, I think, in my mind, digitalization. I say that because there's data being collected in the operations. In many cases, for every 30 seconds, you have a measurement of all kinds of parameters at the platform. And if you are able to analyze and look back and relate the trends before a breakdown, before a maintenance issue, before some event, now you can start to predict those events before they happen and handle them ahead of time. And with handling things ahead of time, you avoid all that shutdown and restart of operations, and that is immediately going to your emissions, right? If you shut the pumps and have to restart, you lose hours and days into that procedure with no payback. So I think that relates immediately to the emissions.
It sounds like this is a real multidisciplinary effort. How do you make sure that everyone is rowing together, as they say?
That's a good question, but I think as an industry, we have a really good track record of working in teams and collaborating, because none of us has the whole picture, right? And so it is definitely a challenge, but one that I believe our industry is relatively well prepared for. And I think there's the leadership and the management systems play a key role there, and that's where putting a few key objectives in place that I share for everybody, right? So safety and no one gets hurt, and we care for our employees, and we're inspiring the people to bring their best selves to work and to enable that accountability at all the levels, and have very clear authority and communication protocols that underpins the workings of a highly performing team, where people know if they're on goal, or if they're in the field, or if they're the kicker, and they're respected for that, and they can make the calls, and everyone can respect the calls that are made. And there's the clear communication plays a very, very important role in how those teams work together.
You noted that having a clear span of authority results in a shared purpose. Talk more about that from a management style perspective.
Yeah, so I think the understanding who's on point for for what. Again, like I just mentioned, clears the path for rowing, like we were saying, rowing together in the same direction. We know each other's roles. We respect each other's roles. We know how you contribute to things going well, and I contribute to things going well. And together, we're going to make things going well. And that's where the shared purpose comes into place: is understanding how the pieces of the puzzle fit together, and being proud of what each of us brings to the table and valuing all the contributions, because none of us has the full answer.
You mentioned that subsurface overrules everything we do. How do you communicate that with your various multidisciplinary teams who believe their part is more significant than the
Right. Well,
subsurface
I mean, I
perspective?
think it's like just think of it as a surgeon team, right? If you don't know what the body is, it's going to be hard for the anesthesiologist or the radiologist or the surgeon to do their part. So first, you need to know what is it that you're dealing with, and then everyone's disciplines can come into play to operate on the sick person.
Exactly. Well, I think we're nearing the end of our hour today. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. And I want to remind our audience later today, you'll receive a link to a recording of today's webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to SCA's website with more information about business advisory services provided by Dr. Olivera Riley for SCA, including those related to asset value optimization, organizational efficiency, non-operator influence, strategy, and transformation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Susan. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.